So first of all, I got to thank Jamie and for giving his talk just now, and many congratulations on the amazing work that he has done and his team, and also for sort of giving me the lead into this piece of work, which is somewhat different from a lot of the talks that you will hear today. But I hope I can still sort of bring this back to the various panel discussions on biomarkers in autism. And what I'll do sort of in the next 20 minutes or so is to focus specifically on sort of more the clinical endpoints in relation to restrictive and repetitive behaviors in autism, and also one research project that we recently completed at Roche that has been looking at sort of understanding and assessing various different scales in autism that measure restrictive and repetitive behaviors called orbiting. Before I start though, this is really work done part of a very large study team who have been really instrumental of getting this study conducted and now also concluded. So I just want to take the moment to thank our clinical teams and all the supporting functions for putting the work in, all the clinical centers and site investigators and their staff who've been really active and involved to collect the data, and obviously all the individuals with autism and their families who've been critical to get this study going and completed and took part in the study. So when we think about RBs and sort of think about the classification of them according to DSM-5, they're sort of listed on the right-hand side here, and you can sort of see that they sort of include quite a short list of sort of symptoms and signs, and they, for example, relate to stereotypical or repetitive motor movements or stereotypies in the way individuals use objects or how they speak. Then there are sort of behaviors related to insistence and sameness, and that may, for example, relate to an inflexible adherence to routines, so sticking to certain routines and rituals during the day, as well as having quite highly restricted and fixated interests, for example, being highly interested in trains or cars or buses, or in London, the tube, for example. And with the recent revision of the DSM, hyper or hyporeactivity activity to sensory input or more unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment were also added to this list. Now, when we think about restrictive and repetitive behaviors, this is actually much broader, and they sort of historically, they have been often conceptualized along a lower order to higher order dimension, where lower order behaviors are referred to sort of more commonly as stereotypical and repetitive behaviors that may or may not have a sensory component. So, for example, relating to motor movements and behaviors can, for example, range from simple tics or motor stereotypies to more elaborative sort of movement of body parts. That may also include speech stereotypies, including echolalia or use of idiosyncratic phrases, or, for example, the use and manipulation of objects. So some children may be seen lining up toys or objects according to size, for example, or flipping objects in a very sort of stereotypical way, or just engaging in play activities in a very repetitive manner. And also, for example, with other objects, so spinning objects, for example, repetitively. And then when we move along this dimension of RBs, we get sort of when we getting into the sort of higher order range, we may see sort of these insistence on sameness behaviors, and that may relate to insisting on particular routines or rituals or particular foods, so sort of very sort of selectivity around certain food items or clothing, but also having real difficulty with change and transitions, and can I describe this as a desire for sameness, essentially. So sort of insistence on sameness on the behavior level, on the cognitive level as well. And then sort of this counterpart to this, we often also see restricted and fixated interests that may sort of move into the stereotypical range of using objects in a play context. So, for example, having quite strong attachment or preoccupation with unusual objects that is often very abnormal in its specificity and intensity. But on the other hand, that could also involve very highly sophisticated interests that sort of go into obsessive compulsive disorders, behaviors, or circumscribed observative interests. So, as you can already see, RRBs, I think, is a very broad class of behaviors that can take many facets and are quite complex. I should also add that there are certain types of RRBs as measured by some scales, for example, that can have quite a negative impact on individuals. For example, repetitive self-injurious behaviors, including nail biting or skin picking. Now, sort of keeping this in mind, what the presentation of RRBs in autism may involve, there are a number of different sort of open questions and challenges in the measurement of these behaviors. And one is, as you've just seen, just the phenotypic complexity of RRBs. And first and foremost, I think that stems also from a very large heterogeneity, these behaviors that are seen both between individuals at any one age. So sort of looking at them in a sort of cross-sectional sense, not only in terms of the type of behaviors that they demonstrate, but also the severity or frequencies of these behaviors that they show. But also we see heterogeneity within individuals across development. So sort of, for example, demonstrating more stereotypical or repetitive motor movements at earlier ages and maybe moving or having sort of more fixated interests as they grow older. I should also add that sort of particular forms of RRBs are not only seen in autism, but also in other neurodevelopmental and genetic conditions, and are also in fact part of normal development. So if you have younger children, particularly in infancy, you may see them engaging in ritualistic behaviors, which are just part of normal development and learning. However, RRBs, at least some, can have also detrimental effects to development for autistic individuals and may hamper or hinder their abilities to sort of adapt in social situations and engage in learning more broadly. Now, when we get to the type of different scales that are used, there's really a very broad range of them available. And as Jamie already mentioned, they can range, for example, from caregiver reported scales to self-reported scales, but also clinician rated scales. Unfortunately, few of them really have a solid track record as an outcome measure in clinical trials. And I think that's also noteworthy is that for none of them, there are really estimates of minimal clinically important difference. So what this means is, if we do see a change on these instruments, for example, on a parent-reported scale, what kind of change is actually clinically important or important for that individual, for example, that really makes a difference for them in everyday life? Then sort of adding to this, there is, when we look at the scale properties, there is more limited evidence, but this may differ from sort of scale to scale. There's more limited evidence on some of the measurement and psychometric properties. And what's also important is the way we sort of conceptualize RRBs is really driven on and highly influenced by the type of scales that we use and the way they are sort of framed and structured. So basically, what kind of subscales, for example, they tap in, what kind of constructs do they actually measure? But looking at the literature and sort of some of the more commonly used scales, we see really sort of inconsistencies in findings on the specific scale structure. And this may be partly related to heterogeneous approaches, either in methodology of samples selection and collection, but also analyses. Then also for some of these scales, they're not validated in autism, and they may come from very different areas. And so there's a real need to apply them in autism-specific samples and evaluate their performance. And again, when we then sort of look at the broader literature for some of these scales, the rigor of the psychometric assessment, once these sort of scales are developed and then sort of starting to get validated, is really variable. And again, this may then lead, in the worst case, to sort of misleading recommendations on the use of these instruments and how to interpret them. So adding all this sort of together, there seems to be not really clear consensus on robust clinical endpoints to measure RRBs in autism, based on sort of a number of different pieces of information. And I think it's also really important in this context, not only to sort of to address sort of all the different limitations and sort of gaps in understanding these scales from a more psychometric quantitative perspective, but also to demonstrate that improvements in at least certain RRBs are relevant to the person family by engaging with stakeholders. So I think that's sort of the context in which sort of the orbiting study was set up. And I'll just sort of describe that study briefly in the next slide. So orbiting was a 12-week observational non-drug study to explore RRB endpoints. So there wasn't a particular compound that was being tested. Instead, the goal was really to explore in parallel multiple different RRB instruments across different age and IQ levels in autism to assess how suitable they are to quantify these behaviors in upcoming treatment trials. As you can see here on the left-hand side, this is the design of the study. So there was a screening visit 3 weeks prior to baseline, where essentially participants were evaluated in terms of their intellectual functioning, in terms of their clinician-rated autism symptoms using the ADOS, and their sort of global severity of autism severity using the CGI. In addition to that, a measure called the CY box was also implemented to recruit a sample that shows more moderate to severe RBs, i.e. there was a particular cutoff used on this screening instrument to essentially select a sample that shows on average more moderate to severe restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Then sort of moving to the bottom left, the study recruited 6 different strata defined by IQ level. So having an IQ higher or equal to 70, or having an IQ lower than 70, as well as across 3 different age groups. So from children, 5 to 12, to adolescents, all the way up to adults. And the idea was really here to get sort of information and data on a very broad sample in order to assess sort of the performance of these scales also in these different strata. On the right-hand side, you see all the different scales that were administered. Because the study was really focused on RRBs, this was sort of where it was really heavy in terms of the assessment protocol. So in addition to the CY box, the MERS was also administered, which is another clinician-rated instrument. And then in addition to this, sort of a bunch of caregiver and self-reported questionnaires, which I will go into a bit more detail in a minute. Then parents were also interviewed using the Vineland to assess adaptive functioning. But here the focus was really also to look more closely at social communicative functioning as assessed by the socialization and the communication domain of the Vineland. Then sort of different measures of anxiety were included, again, using sort of different raters, either clinician or parent or self. Sleep problems were assessed. And then there were also a sort of a wide range of other measures, including the CGI-I, the SSP, which is a measure of sensory symptoms, executive function, quality of life, and the RMED. So it was quite sort of a very comprehensive clinical battery. As I said, this was a non-drug study. So the aim was really to characterize these scales and also look at relationship between these various domains. The study population, so we enrolled 95 children to adolescents, and most of these individuals were also able to complete all assessment visits. The majority of them were males, and as you can see here, sort of the sort of owing to that sort of strata recruitment, you sort of have these sort of buckets of IQ via and sort of age groups, with age ranging from 5 to 36 years and IQ also ranging from 50 to 115. And I think this has also been something that sort of previous studies in the literature have sort of, well, I guess where most of the literature has gone is really sort of in this more higher IQ range, also in relation to RRBs, and I think this study is particularly well suited to also look at this more lower IQ range in terms of the RRBs. I should also mention just the key inclusion criteria. So participants had to have an IQ at least higher than 50, an autism diagnosis according to DSM-5 criteria, and then also confirmed by the ADOS, and then being sort of moderately ill on the CGI and meeting this cutoff on the SciBox. As you can see on the bottom right here, this is just the same figure as on the slide before, but just sort of color-coded by who completed the various different scales. And what I'll focus on today is just to show you some of the key findings that we observed in terms of the caregiver and self-reported scales on the RRB side. So essentially the RBSR, the RBQ2, and the CRIR are 3 caregiver-rated scales, and the RBQ2A and the ARI are 2 self-reported scales for adolescents where applicable and adult participants in the sample. So this is really a summary slide here of sort of some of the key psychometric features of the questionnaire scales that I just outlined as assessed in orbiting. Given that we collected data from baseline to week 2, we were able to gather data on test-retest reliability. This is actually one area that some of these measures have only limited information. Either this information is not available or sort of comes from samples that may not be autism specific, but may actually sort of include a much broader sample. What we found generally is that all these RRB measures, both from the sort of both caregiver and self-reported questionnaire measures, they all demonstrated good to excellent test-retest reliability over this sort of 2-week period, being excellent for the RBSR CRIR, using intra-class correlation coefficients, and good to very good for the RBQ2A and RBQ2. We then also looked at convergent validity between these measures. So essentially what we were interested in is to see how similar these scales are in terms of the constructs that they're assessing. Ideally, we would like to see very high convergence between them, so that we're sort of certain and that we have certainty that these scales measure the same underlying constructs. And as expected, when we looked at the sort of the correlation structure, the convergent validity of these scales, in the context of being completed by the same rater, then we found sort of very strong to very strong correlations between total scores of different measures, but also between subscale scores measuring similar constructs across the measures as well. So essentially, scales measuring, for example, repetitive sensory motor behaviors, they were really convergent across different instruments. We then also looked at change correlations. So essentially, we computed the change from baseline to week 12 for each of the measures, and then correlate those changes to see to what extent do these scales pick up on sort of changes in reported symptoms and behaviors sort of to each other, i.e. do they move with each other? And what we found is sort of a modest degree of convergence for total scores. And when we looked at sort of the subconstructs, we found that change correlations were stronger for insistence on sameness behaviors compared to repetitive sensory motor behaviors, at least on the caregiver reported scales. On the self-reported scales, these change correlations were only weakly related. So that's only relation to the RBQ2A and the ARI. So I think sort of where we're at is that you know, these measures have been sort of tested in various different samples. There has been sort of research on the factor structure, which may be sort of discrepant in some areas, but sort of broadly consistent when we look at the literature. From this data here, we see that they are reliable when we look at test-retest data over sort of a 2-week period. So that sort of adds sort of confidence in using them. We know that they measure broadly similar constructs as reflected by the high convergent validity, and they sort of tend to, at least modestly, on the caregiver reported side, they also tend to pick up on changes in symptoms sort of over sort of a 12-week period. Now, and I just want to sort of finish up with my last slide, and that sort of, I hope, sort of brings it back to the biomarker discussion, is when we looked at changes in restricted repetitive behaviors across the 12 weeks, what we found is that at the sample level, So essentially, that's the graph on the left-hand side, which shows you the change between baseline and week 12 for the different age groups. What we saw is that sort of, on average, there wasn't change. There wasn't sort of on the mean level, at least there wasn't a change. Highlighted here by these box plots, by this horizontal black line, sort of this black line being quite close to zero, and you can sort of disregard that outlier in the younger children group that may drive this sort of drop down here, that mean change. But I think what's really interesting, and that's also something that many others have sort of shown before, is that by just focusing on average changes, that can actually mask quite important individual differences that we see in this sample. So while on average, the sample may not have, sort of on face value, may not have changed that much in terms of the RRBs across this time period, sort of indicating stability of RRBs. When we look at looking at individuals more closely, you can see quite a large variability in the sample in terms of changes across sort of this 3-month period, even in the adult group where we may expect much smaller rates of change and greater stabilities of these RRBs. And I think this is also highlighted on the right-hand side on the bottom here, where you can basically see individual line plots from baseline to week 12, just highlighting, and you can sort of see a few sort of very drastic changes from baseline to week 12 for some participants. And I think I just want to finish up with this sort of last point, is that when we're looking at biomarkers and how they relate to clinical symptoms, I think sort of these case control comparisons, they are really our best bet at right at the start to really have a go at identifying biomarkers in autism. But then when we get actually data back, we often tend to see is that there's large variability in the autism group, and that there are a lot of individuals who actually perform just as their typically developing peers. And so when we also then look at the symptom side, I think we also then need to sort of embrace individual variability rather than sort of trying to dilute them or mask them by just looking at average changes and looking at sort of mean levels. So I think identifying individuals who show sort of greater change across time that exceeds, for example, the standard error of the measurement, and that sort of goes in a direction where some of these changes are clinically important and meaningful to them, I think this is really where we should be headed, and that will help to then identify clinical, for example, a particular clinical responder subgroup that's then also linked up with particular biomarker signatures. And on that note, thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions now.
Julian, thank you so much. Congratulations on the exciting work and validation of such an important questionnaire and excellent psychometric properties. That's pretty remarkable. It's very well needed. A few questions from the audience. One, it's interesting that you have a broad definition of RRBs. As a parent, I see many older autism persons with a sort of rigid compulsive behavior that overlaps with OCD and repetitive behavior. Have you identified this type of subgroup? There's literature that suggests that this behavior is connected to GI constipation as a comorbidity. They're curious your thoughts on that.
Right, great. Yeah, thanks a lot for your feedback. So I mean, in terms of I guess identifying this particular subgroup, I guess within this particular sample, it may be quite sort of underpowered. So basically, we probably won't have enough individuals in the sample who show sort of these types of behaviors to then also link that back to potential biomarkers and sort of essentially investigate that subgroup sort of further. I think this is probably something that would need to be done in another much more sort of powerfully more powered studies, essentially. Yeah. Okay.
Another question. Curious, since your study's IQ cutoff was 50, do you see moderate to high RBs impacting accurate assessment of a person's IQ?
Right, I see. So I mean, I think in terms of the IQ assessments, retrospectively, I mean, all the IQ assessments, if well, let me start over. If somebody wasn't able to complete the IQ assessment, this was basically then deemed a screen failure, so that participant then wouldn't have been able to be enrolled in the study and complete the baseline and week 2 and week 12 assessment of the study. So at that point, we wouldn't know, you know, if, for example, failure on the particular IQ tests may relate to RRBs and how they relate to RRBs. So, and I think from memory, there weren't that many who were unable to do the IQ assessment, or where this was a reason for not being able to participate in the study.
Another question, in addition to a qualitative approach to RRBs, have you guys also integrated or thoughts of integrating actigraphy or video recording that could be rated by a rater? Thoughts there?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, so unfortunately, in this particular study, the team didn't implement sort of a qualitative component, if I remember correctly. However, in future studies, what we will do is to include, for example, exit interviews with families. And I think that will be a chance to really elicit, and they sort of the way they will be set up, this is sort of not sort of fully fleshed out. So I think there's ample space to really make great use of those interviews to elicit sort of feedback on RRBs also in particular. And I think this could be a really interesting approach there. Yeah.
Great. Given that you point out some of the inter-individual variation in RRBs over time, are you guys looking at any sort of biological markers such as heart rate variability, microbiome, metabolic data, anything that from a biological perspective may correlate or predict these changes?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I did mention this in this talk because sort of this data is still sort of being collected and QC, sort of quality controlled and sort of sifted through, and but we do also have a range of digital biomarkers in this particular study, which assess sort of readouts from that sort of map onto RRBs on sort of different behaviors that fall into sort of that dimension of RRBs that I highlighted earlier. So I think including also heart rate variability actually. So I think this will be a really interesting and exciting area to go in sort of in the next coming months, I guess, is that once this data is ready to be analyzed, is to really understand sort of those aspects, and then also link them back to the clinical scales and symptoms sort of as more traditionally done, and then also see convergence and also divergence across them.
Another question, are you aware of any brain imaging that may correlate with your psychometric tests?
So, I mean, in this particular, yeah.
So I guess said another way, something, even the EEG data that Jamie presented in the previous talk, have you guys looked to see if there's any correlation with your RRB work?
So I mean, in this particular study we haven't, but the EU AIMS consortium and our AIMS to Trials consortium that Jamie mentioned earlier. In addition to the tasks that he highlighted in this particular study, there were also sort of a bunch of tasks that are really sort of relevant or thought to be relevant in terms of restriction repetitive behavior. So for example, reversal learning task that one of my colleagues is working on. And I believe that particular manuscript is either under review or really being close to publishing. Daisy Crowley. So if you look, I can probably post this later as well in the chat if you're interested. So this study looked at also EEG as a sort of the technology behind a particular marker to look at RRBs. So yeah, I'm happy to share that later. But in this particular study, we didn't include any of that sort of task. Yeah.